Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the Harborne Islamic Study Circle HISC Seerah session 179. So the last session that we did last week, we talked about the process of consolidating the peace and starting sort of winning over the hearts and minds and spending time explaining what Islam is to the newly conquered people of Mecca. And part of that is setting down a new set of norms, customs, rules and regulations, and getting rid of some of the old ways of life. And we talked about how the Prophet ﷺ told people to destroy their personal idols. We'll come back onto that in a second. So any idols that they have in their own house, to get rid of those, and also how the Prophet dispatched some platoons to go and destroy the publicly worshipped idols that sat in their specific temples, and some of the idols like al-Uzza, Manat and Suwa, and then there's some stories of some embodied souls also being killed that somehow linked to these idols. And then we spent some time talking about one of the massacres that occurred as a mistake, an honest mistake, but a mistake that was undertaken by Khalid bin Walid. So he was sent on a mission to the tribe of Banu Makhzum, and they panicked because there was some sort of some history of beef between his family and the tribe. But then when things calmed down, they professed their Islam, but they used the wrong terminology. So they heard that to be a Muslim you were a Sabi'un. So then they said, we are Sabi'un. But Khalid bin Walid, having been one of those accusers, just a few years before, he misunderstood them saying that we are Sabi'un, and he took it at face value that they had become Sabian, rather than their understanding, which was we have become Muslim. Some senior Muslims refused to partake in that massacre because they understood what the tribe were trying to say, that they've become Muslim, but it got lost in translation. So Khalid then had a go at some of these senior Sahabi like Ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Rawaha and Abdurrahman ibn Auf. So they refused to join in the massacre, sort of a bit of a mutiny. Khalid was upset with them and he cursed them. And then the Prophet, he found out about this, and then he put his hands up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in front of the Kaaba, and he absolved himself from this crime, and made it known that this was not part of the mission. And then when Khalid comes back, the argy-bargy is probably continuing, and the Prophet ﷺ admonishes Khalid for cursing his Sahabi. The Prophet then dispatches Ali to pay some generous blood money to the people that had been falsely killed, but under false pretenses. And we talked about one of the stories included in that is of a couple who were betrothed who also died. And then we finished off with the fact, and we'll probably revisit this, inshallah, if we have time, how this is all a result of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and this is part of this manifest victory where the Prophet ﷺ is expanding the domain of Islam, Darul Islam, based upon a direct consequence of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which at the time was seen as a defeat for the Muslims, but now it is the manifest victory that Allah promised. So today's session, inshallah, we'll just talk about some of the fiqh that's associated with the treaty of, with the conquest of Mecca. So some of the rulings that happened during these 19 or so days. And we talked before about how the Prophet ﷺ, when he's going on these trips and battles, a lot of times, rulings would be sent down during the battles, during sort of not just on the battlefield, but the journey to and from. And again, this is why some of the scholars say that to be classified as a Sahabi, you need to have been with the Prophet ﷺ for a year or two, and or gone on a battle with him, one or two at least. And again, it just shows that you're, the level of closeness you have to the message is if you travel on these battles. So these are quite important. And again, there's a lot of fiqh that's associated with each of the battles, and certainly with the conquest of Mecca. And again, drawing on from what we talked about last week, this is part of the consolidating the new set of norms, the new customs, the new rules, and making sure that they are implemented and understood, especially by the new Muslims. So some of the things that we'll cover, that we've mentioned again, but we'll cover again, and we'll put them in this section because a lot of the historians and the people who've collated these things put them together in terms of these occurred at the time of the conquest of Mecca. So again, we've covered it before, but the Prophet ﷺ, he reinforces the sanctity of the Haram of Mecca. So Mecca has always been holy, and again, he reinforced that message that Mecca will remain holy. And we talked about how he mentioned this at the very first sort of sermon, that either the day of the conquest or the day after the conquest, where he gathered the people and said, people, Allah has made Mecca sacred, a haram. And the day that he created the heavens and the earth, and it shall remain sacred until the day of judgment. And it's not allowed for any believer who believes in Allah and the last day to shed any blood, whether animal or human blood, in the haram. So you can't fight or hunt and kill people like that. And again, as part of the rules of it being haram, we talked about how you're not allowed to pluck the leaves of the trees in Mecca, and then an exception was given when Ibn Abbas wanted that. And then the Prophet also mentioned that although on this occasion some blood was spilt, Mecca is still a haram. And the Prophet goes on to explain that, and he made this explicit, that Mecca was never halal before me or after me. And even for me, it was made halal just for an hour of the day. And again, we talked about this when the Prophet ﷺ, he allowed the original massacre that led to the breach of the contract to be avenged. So we talked about how Khuzā massacred Banu Bakr. So now how Khuzā were massacred by Banu Bakr. So now Khuzā are given permission on the day of the conquest, just for an hour or two, to exact their revenge, whatever they could, from Banu Bakr. And the Prophet is explicit about that only for this short period of time. Don't use this precedence as a general precedence that fighting is allowed. This is purely an exception that was given to the Prophet. So you can't, infer any other precedence from this. And the Prophet made that more than explicit. So we can't turn around to say, because the Prophet fought in Mecca, it's something that can be allowed for future generations. So the sanctity of Mecca is re-established, reinforced, and its primacy is there in our deen and how we approach Islam. So another ruling a separate ruling now, moving on to some of the other issues around the fiqh issues. Again, it's to do with halal and haram. But there's a general principle in Islam, which is essentially if an item, a thing, or an object is haram in of itself, then it's haram to sell it and profit from it. And again, it's well known, for example, around the flesh of swine, pig meat, and we cannot profit from it. And here it's related to alcohol and idols and carcasses. And so there's a hadith in Bukhari where the Prophet says, Allah and His Messenger forbid you from selling alcohol, carcasses and idols. And we talked before last week how Makkah is a religious center. People would come and they would get their souvenirs, and part of their souvenirs is getting a local idol, getting an idol from Makkah. And again, that carries more weight, not just emotionally, but quasi-religiously for the pagans, because they've got an idol from Makkah. So when the Prophet ﷺ, he forbade worshipping idols, and he told people to destroy the idols in their houses, which they did, there was a stock of idols that they had. So then the people of Makkah would put on a sale, cut price idols for all the other people who were traveling to Makkah. So they would start selling these idols and trying to get rid of their stock. Prophet ﷺ found out about this, and then he made it clear to the people that you're not allowed to sell these idols. You're not allowed, and so you've got, now that, and we all know the story when alcohol was prohibited in Medina, the streets of Medina were then flowing with the alcohol and the khamr that was poured into the streets. Here, people, they have that capitalist, materialistic mindset. Well, we've got these idols, let's cut our losses, let's sell them. Oh, well, we've got this alcohol, we can't consume it, it's haram for us, let's sell it to the other pagans or sell it to other people. And brothers and sisters, no, you can't do any of that. You've got to destroy it, because if the thing itself is haram, you can't profit from it. And again, so this hukam is reinforced in during this time. So they're not allowed to sell these idols to any of the other hujaj. Idolatry in itself hasn't been abolished. It will take time for the pagans to all become Muslims. So there are still pagans who are coming to Makkah, but the sale of these idols has been prohibited and banished. So all the idols in the temples were smashed, all the personal idols are smashed, and there's no trade in these haram things. So that which is haram to use, it's haram to benefit from. It's haram to sell to others. And again, this is a general principle. There are obviously some exceptions, and for example, for men, as men, it's haram for us to wear silk or gold, but we do have exceptions around that. But as a general principle, if it's haram as a thing or an object, you can't profit from it either. So again, this ruling was one of those that is referred to or reinforced during these sort of 2 to 3 weeks when the Prophet ﷺ is in Makkah, in the conquest of Mecca. Some other rules around traveling and prayer. So we'll talk about some of those that were not necessarily just established, but again, because the rules around qasr and traveller's prayer were there before, but again, they are consolidated and people see them in action here, because not just that the Prophet ﷺ is sending a platoon. Here, the Prophet ﷺ is doing this, and we talked last week or the session before about how the Prophet ﷺ, all his prayers in the Haram, he's doing as qasr. He's shortening all his prayers, as in, well, not all his. He's shortening all his the 4 rakah prayers to 2 rakah, right? So this shortening of his prayers is happening, despite the fact that each prayer, as we said before, in the Haram, the holiest of the holy places, each prayer is equivalent to 100,000 in terms of blessings anywhere else, right? You pray in Jama'at, you get 27 times the blessings for that prayer. You pray in Medina, you get 1,000 times blessings for each prayer. You pray in the Haram, you get 100,000 prayers, okay, equivalent blessings. So some people might argue, well, then the longer you pray, the more blessings you get. Well, then that's not the case. You get more blessings for shortening those prayers. Obviously, nowadays, if we go to Mecca, if you're part of the congregation, a continuous congregation, that's what most scholars say, it has to be a contiguous congregation. So from the Imam, you've got the rows and lines to wherever you are in the Haram or even on the streets outside. If it's continuous, you're part of that prayer. If you're behind the Imam, you follow the Imam. But obviously, if you miss that opportunity and get the benefit from that, and you have to pray by yourself, then it's recommended to shorten your prayer to 2. So again, we talked about that. Then there's controversy, and again, I don't want to go into the fiqh of it now in terms of what constitutes travel and for how long. So some scholars say you're a traveler for 3 days. Some say you're a traveler for 15 days. Some say you are essentially indefinitely a traveler as long as you're outside your home, or you're considered you're a traveler for as long as you consider yourself to be traveling away from home, or that you're outside of your home city. So again, I'd encourage people to go and ask people that they trust what is the definition of a traveler and for how long you remain a traveler. So whether there's a time limit, what that time limit is, and how long you can then be considered a traveller and shorten your prayers, and whether that's a physical thing or a psychological thing. So again, there needs to be a physical distance. So it's not just travelling outside your house or travelling outside the walls of your city, but some scholars say there needs to be a minimum distance. So personally, the opinion that I've adopted is, and I was told that this is the strongest opinion, but again, there are lots of different opinions, is traveling for 15 days away from what you consider your home, and the travel needs to be more than a journey of 48 miles. And it can be distance traveled, not necessarily as the crow flies. So there's lots of different scholarly breakdowns of what constitutes a traveller, how far, how long, and where. So it's important to understand that for yourself, adopt it, and stick to that one opinion, not chopping and changing those opinions. So and then be tolerant of those people that have got other opinions if they are valid Islamic opinions. And it's important because because there's a lot of issues which are related to that travel. So it's not just shortening your prayers. There's also the question of combining some of your prayers as a traveler. So shortening your prayers and shortening and combining your prayers. Again, there are rules around that. So not just shortening the 4 rakah to 2 rakah, but also joining the dhuhr and asr and joining the Maghrib and Isha. So these, again, it depends on your definition of travel, being a traveler, and what that entails. So not just for prayer, it's also for fasting. So we talked before about how the Prophet ﷺ, he instructed the Sahabi to break their fast. So he took some water and he drank it in front of the people because they started the journey during Ramadan. So the conquest is during Ramadan, the 17th of Ramadan, and then they stay for some time after that. So, but during that time, in Ramadan, they are travelers and they are not fasting. And again, so as a traveler, you get more blessings by taking the benefits that Allah gives you for the traveler. So you're allowed to break your fast during Ramadan, again, for a legitimate reason like travel. And again, the scholars, will then differ in terms of when you consider traveling. Is it when you make the intention of traveling on that day, how far you travel on that day, or once you've gone beyond a certain distance, then you're allowed to break your fast? So again, these things need to be thought about beforehand, and you adopt the strongest opinion and you stick to that. The other thing that we talked about before in terms of prayer and being and praying is al-Duha. We talked about how the Prophet ﷺ was seen by Hani praying al-Duha, and he prayed 8 rakaat after the conquest was completed. And we know that you can pray either 2, 4, 6 or 8 rak'ah as Salatul Duha. But the Prophet ﷺ, he prayed 8, and some scholars consider that if you are going to pray, that is the perfect one to pray, although obviously it's a nafil prayer anyway. Another important fiqh a benefit of the treaty of the Conquest of Mecca is the fact that when you have a legally binding treaty, breaking one significant part of that treaty, that contract, is equivalent to negating the whole contract. So the Quraysh, they broke one clause of the Treaty of Hudaibiyah. And the Prophet ﷺ, he interpreted the breaking of that one clause of the whole treaty as being equivalent to cancelling or breaking the whole treaty. So it's an all for one for all, essentially. So it's a whole thing. So it's not seeing the breaking of the treaty as a piecemeal thing, and you sort of you have a proportionate response, based on the number of elements of the treaty. No, breaking one element or a significant element of the treaty is equivalent to making the whole treaty null and void. And again, that's part of your contract and a contract issue. And on the basis of them breaking that one condition of the treaty, the whole treaty was cancelled, and that gave the Prophet ﷺ the excuse to, having nullified the treaty or consider it nullified, null and void, conquer Mecca. And obviously this was also the fear that the Quraysh had, because they dispatched Abu Sufyan to try to renegotiate and extend the treaty of Hudaybiyah prior to the conquest, and we talked about that before. Next couple of rules are to do with money and inheritance and stealing. So we talked before how Hind bint Utbah, she would steal or take money from her husband, and the Prophet ﷺ allowed that. So wives are allowed to take money from their husbands without their husbands knowing, so long as it is for a legitimate cause for the family. So it's not a question of you can just, wives can take money from their husbands and, buy extravagant dresses and hats and handbags and cars. If it's for the household, if the husband is miserly and stingy and not providing enough for the family, then the wife can take money for the family without the husband's knowing, so without asking for permission. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he heard Hind ibn Utbah criticizing Abu Sufyan for his stinginess, which forced her to take some money for the house, he didn't admonish her for that. So again, it needs to be a legitimate cause, and for that to be allowed if the household expenses are not being kept. Another thing related to stealing, so that's not classified as stealing, but there was another very famous incident that most of us are aware of. That is when a noble woman from Banu Makhzum, she was caught stealing. So the rules, they're in Mecca, the rules are clear around stealing and theft. And then this noble woman, we don't know exactly what she stole, but she was caught stealing. And then there was a big fuss because this is a noble woman and she's been caught stealing. And they know the hudood around stealing is chopping of the hands. So some of the noble people, they're freaking out. They're thinking, well, we can't have this happen. Let's go to see if there's some flex in the rules. They ask around and there's no flex. This is hudood of Allah. They need to implement it. And there's no wiggle room. And there's no way out because she's been caught. So some of the nobles of Banu Makhzum, they're thinking, well, this is shameful. We can't have such a prominent person, be treated like that. What can we do? How can we petition? How can we change the rules? So they go, they know Usama ibn Zayd is the beloved of the Prophet ﷺ. So he is Usama, son of Zayd bin Haritha, who the Prophet ﷺ had initially adopted as his own son, Zayd, and then was a slave and then adopted son, and then was told that he can't, adoption can only be that type of adoption is not allowed. So the Prophet ﷺ, and then Usama died in one of the battles, Battle of Mu'tah, where he was in charge. So they knew the Prophet ﷺ had a really soft spot for Usama. So and Usama's just a teenager, he's a youngster, 13, 14 perhaps. So they call Usama and they pressurize him and they try to, influence him because these are the noble people. And so they basically beg Usama to go and beg the Prophet ﷺ to bend the rules for this noble lady. So the senior people from Banu Makhzum, they went to Usama and said, why don't you suggest to the Prophet ﷺ, that he forgives this lady because she's very noble and she's very sorry, etc., etc. And so Usama, he felt pressured into this. And again, he's just a teenager. So he went to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, Ya Rasulullah, this lady, she's done this wrong, but she's very noble. Why don't you just forgive her and let her go? And it's a very famous story. The Prophet ﷺ, he got really angry and enraged and very upset that Usama would come to him and with a request as heinous as this. And he goes to him, you want me to intercede when it comes to the hudood of Allah? Wallahi, if my own daughter was to commit this crime, I would not forgive her. And then, so having told Usama off, he goes and gathers everybody round, and then he gives a khutbah, and he shouts and makes it clear that, verily, if my own daughter, Fatima bint Muhammad, committed a crime, I would not forgive her, and I would establish the punishment. I would chop her hands off if she was the one who committed this crime. So again, it's not a question of we have, the Prophet doesn't have the ability to pardon the hudood. We're not able to dish out pardons, at the end of your presidency like this, or as a king who can pardon. This is the hudood of Allah. Everyone is equal when it comes to the hudood of Allah. And Prophet again, he said that this is the thing that caused the peoples of the past to fall into disrepute, is when they would treat the nobles different to the common people. We see that in society today, here especially in the Western society, even in Muslim majority societies, because they don't implement Islam. It's one rule for the rich, one rule for everybody else. And certainly in the Western countries, it's one rule for the rich, one rule for everyone else, and a separate rule for the Muslims who have a particularly harsh interpretation of the law against them. On the Prophet, he's establishing this rule. We cannot have this time. Everyone literally is equal in the eyes of Allah with regards to these things, and there is no wiggle room for people to bend the rules when it comes to the hudood. Once the hudood has been established and confirmed, it has to be done. And then Aisha later narrates, and this is a very important point as well, is that this particular lady, she's had her hands chopped off, the hudood has been implemented, but she would still come and petition the Prophet ﷺ for favors. She would still come, to Aisha and to the others and ask for things. So once the hudood has been done, she's not treated a criminal for the rest of her life. She's not an outcast, even though the crime is obvious, because she's, it's visible to everyone, the hudood that's been, done on her. She's not treated negatively or stereotyped as a criminal for the rest of her life. She still has equal access as every other citizen to law, to her right, to the Prophet ﷺ. So punishment is done, and then we move on as a society. So again, that's a really important aspect of law that's been established and fully established here during the conquest of Mecca. Another principle of law is around inheritance. And again, this is to do with Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. And again, we all know that there's formulae in the Qur'an that are mentioned in sort of the early phase of the Medina surahs, that who gets what in inheritance. And again, Allah was very clear in terms of who gets what, didn't leave this up to people. And there's particular, quite explicit formulae about percentages, who gets what percentage, sons, daughters, and everyone else, and it's written down. And again, some people say that's why the Muslim scholars are so good at maths, is because they have to be good at maths, they have to be good at algorithms to work out these percentages. But there is, and again, we know this now, because of the establishment of the inheritance laws is so well known in society. But the principle that you're not allowed to give away all your wealth is well established, but the maximum leeway you can have is 1/3 of your wealth. So Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, very senior elite Sahabi, he fell ill and he thought he was going to die. And so he asked the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Allah's blessed me with a lot of money, and I've only got 2 daughters. So what if I give away 2/3 of my wealth to people that I want, whether it's friends or other relatives or whatever else, or charitable philanthropy or whatever? Can I give away 2/3? And the Prophet ﷺ says, no, that is far too much. Then he goes, Sa'ad says, well, what about if I give away 1/2? And the Prophet ﷺ, That's still far too much. So that says, well, what about if I give away a third? And the Prophet says a third is fine. That's the maximum you're allowed. But even a third is being very generous, right? And again, and we've heard the Prophet say this before. Were you to leave it to were you to leave your descendants rich, it is better for you than leaving them poor and having them to beg. This is your kith and kin. You should, as a principle, look after them. So as much as you can give to make your children comfortable through what Allah has blessed you with, that is better. These are your relatives. If you have a lot of surplus, then fine, you're allowed to give up to a third, but you don't want to be in a situation where if you give away too much, your own family is then forced to be in a situation where they're having to beg for money, or, so it's good to be generous, but it's better to be generous with your own family. So again, it's just setting the principle, but the maximum that you're allowed to give is a third of your wealth. As the sort of allocated sort of pre-shares in inheritance. So again, that principle is being established here at this time in the Conquest of Mecca. The next two or three are to do with marriage and children. I mean, inheritance again is to do with marriage and children, but the next are also to do with marriage and children. The one is to do with when converts become Muslim. And if they're married, do they have to redo their nikah? And we talked before how one of the Prophet's daughters, she didn't need to redo her nikah when her ex, who was in Mecca, finally came to Medina and settled there and became Islam. She wasn't required to redo the nikah. They weren't. It wasn't demanded that they reaffirm their vows. The same here. Here you've got large numbers of people in Mecca becoming Muslim. Sometimes the men folk became Muslim and the women later. Other times the women became Muslim first and the men folk later, like Safwan ibn Umayyah and Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl. Right? Ikrimah, he ran away. His wife, a partner, became Muslim. He comes back a few days later, or weeks later, and he's given time to think about Islam, and others are given time to think about Islam, but they're still married. So again, the principle here is that they're not obliged to do a new nikah if within a few months, 2 or 3 months, the scholars say, the spouse then also becomes Muslim. Again, there's some difference of opinion, but as a general principle, if one of them becomes Muslim, the other one is given maybe 2 to 3 months to consider the new reality. If they, and then if they decide to become a Muslim couple, then they don't need to redo their nikah. They're still considered married in the eyes of the Sharia. But if after, say, 3 months, the other spouse decides not to become a Muslim, then the other rules then kick in. But certainly if, within a couple of months, they don't need to reaffirm their vows and do a new nikah and a new mahar, etc., etc. So again, that principle is established quite firmly during the conquest of Mecca. Another one to do with marriage is the prohibition of zawaj mu'ta, or temporary marriage, and we've talked about this before after Khaybar. So amongst Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, it's a well-established principle that temporary marriage is not allowed. Mu'ta is not allowed. So there's a difference between, some scholars say that it was allowed, prohibited, then re-allowed, and now firmly prohibited. But others say that it was halal and then made haram at Khaybar, and then it is just re-emphasized that it's haram at the conquest of Mecca, or that some say that it was not necessarily prohibited after Khaybar, but strongly discouraged, but now formally prohibited forever at the conquest of Mecca. But as a general principle, nowadays, I mean that for Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we do not accept temporary marriage as being a valid form of contract between two people. So again, that's another ruling from the conquest of Mecca. Another one to do with marriage is that a child is to the bed it was born, right? So a child is to the bed it was born. So there was a dispute between two prominent Sahabi who, in the time of Jahiliyyah, before they became Muslim, they disputed over one of the children. So Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, and we talked about Sa'd, and another one, I think it's Abdullah ibn Zuma. There was a young boy, and they both contested fatherhood. So they both wanted custody of that child. So they, and again, this happened before they were Muslim, before they were Sahabi. Okay, so they both contested custody of that child. They both claimed to be the father of that child. So they went to the Prophet ﷺ to arbitrate on that matter, who is the father. So obviously one of them is married and the other one is alleging an affair, an adulterous affair. But they're both saying the child is mine. This obviously occurred before Islam. So the Prophet ﷺ, he stipulated a ruling, which is the child is to the bed it was born on. So whoever was married at the time, the child belongs to that couple. Okay, and again, when we see this, a principle throughout in terms of, and this has lots of ramifications in terms of, not just legitimacy, but in terms of the primacy of marriage, that the child belongs to the bed that was born on. We assume that the child is born in wedlock, and that is the assumption. Okay, so we don't, and we're not allowed to question and challenge the parenthood of the child that is born in marriage. Okay, so again, we need to be very careful about brandishing, accusations, false accusations, and tarnishing children and people who are married with a really serious charge of infidelity. And again, we've talked before about in terms of infidelity and adultery or adulterous affairs, you need to have eyewitnesses to the actual act happening, and it can't be through conspiring. You need to accidentally come across the famous phrase, the pen in the ink, and so accusing a child of being illegitimate, or accusing an individual of having an affair without proof is a very serious matter. Even if it's done in anger, you can't accuse people of having affairs, being committing adultery without proof. And again, people will be accountable for their words and their accusations if you accuse other people of having affairs, or children of not having being born to the right parents. It's a very serious thing. And again, this matter was reinforced here during the conquest of Mecca. Last couple of minor things, not minor things, but last couple of other fiqh issues we'll talk about. One, again, we've mentioned both of these before. One is that you're allowed to dye your hair. if you have grey hair, it's, the Prophet ﷺ encouraged people to dye their hair if their hair is getting white. And especially if you take pride in having white hair, because it's a sign of wisdom and being sagacious and old, then again it's strongly encouraged to dye your hair. And we learned about how the Prophet ﷺ asked Abu Bakr to dye his father's hair, Abu Quhafa. Abu Quhafa was very advanced in age, so he's 70, 80, so it's encouraged for him not to dye it jet black to try and get back to his youth. So it's to dye it another shade. But again, it's allowed, if not encouraged, for the older people to dye their hair. Some say both men and women. And then the final one to mention is that you don't need to be, and again it's important for us in our day and age, you don't need to be in a state of ihram every time you enter Makkah. And again, some people go under this false pretense that every time you go to Makkah you have to do Umrah or you have to go in ihram. You don't need to do that, because the Prophet ﷺ, when he entered Makkah, he didn't enter as a pilgrim, he entered it in his armor. He entered, yes, he conquered it, but he entered in his armor. He wasn't in ihram when he first entered Makkah. So you're allowed to visit Makkah and not do Umrah and or not be in a state of ihram when you enter Makkah. Obviously for us, living away from Makkah, it's not our hometown, or we're not near there. We're not taxi drivers. We're not delivery people. We're not business people who may go in and out of Makkah, once, twice a day, or a few times a day even. For us going to Makkah, it does not make sense. It belittles the status of Makkah if we don't enter Makkah in ihram the first time we go. We're spending tens of thousands of pounds sometimes now to go visit Makkah when the COVID restrictions are over. It just would not make sense for us not to do it in ihram. That's the status of Makkah as being holy, as being Haram. So that's where we started today's session. So for us, strongly encouraged when we enter into Makkah, we should try to be in ihram, but we don't have to be, right? We may have other things going on and then enter into a state of ihram. And do the rituals that allow us to undertake our umrah when we do it. But again, it's not necessary for us to be in that state. So anyway, I'll finish there. I'm sure there are other issues of fiqh, but these are some of the main points. Inshallah, next week we'll start off with some of the benefits and lessons from the conquest of Mecca before going on to the siege of Taif and then later the battle of Hunain, inshallah. So Jazakallah khair. Thank you for listening. Do remember us in your dua. Do remember the ummah in your duas. Jazakallah khair. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.